He is called the most powerful investor in the world, a man whose actions and utterances have rocked world financial markets. The Quantum Fund, which he started in 1969 with $4 million, is now worth $4.5 billion. But lately, George Soros spends more than time giving away money than he spends making it. He was born in Hungary in 1930 and after a stint in England immigrated to the United States in 1956. He now devotes 90% of his time to the Soros Foundation, which have through 1994 committed or spent $1 billion, much of it in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. We're pleased to have him here. Welcome. You disagree with any of that I just said? I mean, that's essentially an outline.
No, it's true. I think the percentage is now more like 80-20. But
20% back on
business, but it used to be 90-10.
Why did you shift back?
Well, I think that things are cooling off a little bit in Eastern Europe. Things are taking shape. Not exactly the shape that I'd like to see, but sort of the revolutionary fervor is kind of dying out. And so I think that my own revolutionary fervor is dying out.
You're losing some of your interest in Eastern Europe?
No, I'm not losing my interest, but it's the difference between a short spurt and a long distance running. And I think now we are in for a long distance there, because in the short term, we actually lost the opportunity to transform that part of the world into an open society.
Tell me how that happened. I mean, how did we lose the opportunity? Because people that you admire, like Havel in Czechoslovakia, Wałęsa in Poland, others throughout Russia, some that you don't admire as much, Yeltsin, for example. Give me a sense of where you thought the window of opportunity was and how it was missed.
Well, you had
it's different in each country, but
you had a revolution. Basically, you had a universal closed society, communism, and the communist dogma failed. That is irreversible. There was an opportunity to extend the sway of universal open society, the civilization we live in, to that part of the world. But one has to recognize that the open society is a more advanced form of organization, and you can't make the step in one short interval, and you can't do it without a lot of help from the outside. Now, I tried to give whatever help I could. That's why I got so involved. But I'm afraid the rest of the world didn't quite see it that way, and didn't really show sufficient belief in the concept of an open society as an ideal for which it is worth to make sacrifices.
And in the scope of history, how serious a mistake do you consider that?
I think it is very, very serious, because this area, I'm not talking now of Hungary and Central Europe, but I'm particularly of the former Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia, is breaking down. And is breaking down into more or less closed societies based on a principle of ethnic identity, of ethnic nationalism. And in order to mobilize society behind an ethnic or national goal, you have to find an enemy. And so this is a recipe.
So you found another ethnic group to make a scapegoat for your own problems.
Right. That's right, and to mobilize society behind your own brand of politics, because basically you are in the hands of demagogues who are exploiting what is a basic human instinct, which is a belonging, sense of belonging.
Let me stick with the former Yugoslavia first. In terms of Bosnia, what should be done?
Well, I'm pleased that finally we are showing some sign of strength. Our goal should be primarily to do what we went there for, which was to deliver humanitarian aid to protect the civilian population. We have declared these protected areas. We should protect them and use whatever means are necessary to do it.
Whatever means are necessary is a loaded term.
Yeah, that means that you actually have to use force because you are up against force. I mean, Sarajevo, for instance, is basically a camp. Call it maybe concentration camp might be just a little too strong, but it is effectively that, and it's surrounded, and due to the terms of engagement that the troops are there for, they are actually part of the system that are keeping the people of Sarajevo oppressed. I mean, for instance, you can't have mail go into Sarajevo,
right.
Even though you have an airport. You don't have telephone connections because you can't put in the telephone equipment. So It's an intolerable situation that we have gotten us into. It's the most humiliating experience, I think, for our civilization since the Second World War.
And do you therefore condemn all of the Western European countries and the United States and its leadership for their inaction?
I do. I think that they've gotten off on the wrong track because they have, instead of taking a stand against aggression,
and genocide.
Well, genocide, again, maybe just too strong, but I think it is genocide. It is genocide, but why quibble about it? It is genocide. Instead of standing up to that, they wanted to negotiate, conciliate, and that is an impossibility because they were not willing to bring force to bear on the situation, and they got entangled in this futile search for a peace settlement, which in fact is on principles that we cannot subscribe to. So I think we should have done the only thing that we undertook to do, and that is to protect the civilian population.
And that would have made, in some cases, some say, the imposition of troops on the ground. And the American public, and perhaps the European public, is not prepared to make that commitment to the principles you're talking about.
Well,
doesn't seem to be.
No, absolutely not. I think that the commitment of American ground troops is out of the question.
Yeah. But can you do it without the commitment of ground troops?
I'm sure that it can be done because I think that both the Serbs and the Croats understand the use of force from the air if it is applied. Because, you see, people talk about repetition of Vietnam, that you get sucked in and so on. I think this would be totally unacceptable. But they have an unfinished war between them, so they cannot afford to lose their military assets. So they cannot afford to be bombed, and therefore, if you threaten them with it and it's credible, you will actually not even have to deliver it.
Let me move to Russia. Do you think that country is on the border, is moving towards some kind of open civil war?
Well,
how fragile is the stability there?
It is extremely fragile because the economy is in very bad shape politically.
And reformers seem to be out of favor.
I think that reform has been tried and it has failed. Partly because of the ineptitude of the reformers themselves, partly because of the magnitude of the problem, and partly because the paucity of support from the West, because they could not possibly have succeeded without substantial support, which they were not getting. So reform has unfortunately failed, and now I think you have really two choices. One is this rise of nationalism, which would require a strong central state again, or a continuing disintegration, regionalism. And the trouble with that is that regionalism or federalism, which otherwise would be an excellent solution, without law, without the rule of law, is anarchy, and it's a breakdown. And that is the most likely direction that the country is going.
What do you think of Yeltsin?
I think he's a spent force.
They should go from the scene, leave the scene.
No, it's the only thing we have got left.
But he has no new ideas and he's not prepared for the challenge.
Well, as I say, I think he's a burnt-out case. He has basically lost a lot of support in the confrontation with Parliament. And it's a very weak reed that is, let's say, standing between us and disaster.
So, well, yeah, and what's going to happen? I mean, what do you think will happen over the next? Well, I mean, if it's a weak reed standing, if he is a weak reed which stands between us and disaster, you know, what do we do? And what is it the only horse we can ride, so to speak, without?
Which, well, we should still stand for reform because, and I think it would be a mistake to support Yeltsin at all cost. I think Yeltsin has now turned away from reform. The new government wants to re-establish, let's say, or establish the dominance of the large industrial complexes.
You know, almost a managed economy.
Right, and I don't think that we can possibly support that. Now, I am, for instance, continuing with full force on the longer-term projects like education, support of science, building the infrastructure of an open society. I think that has to go on.
Let me just go back now, because it's fascinating what you did, because it is my understanding you made a huge killing in an investment sense in 1992, betting that the sterling would fall, correct?
Well, it was not a particularly huge killing. It was just one of the many things that we did.
How much money did you make?
Well, the fund did make in the
fund.
region. The quantum fund made in the region of $1 billion, but it was just part of in the last year. All the funds together showed a profit of $3.8 billion. And that was not the year of the sterling killing.
Yes.
So we actually have been very successful over the years, sometimes more successful. We have sort of waves. The last 3 years have been very successful.
Have you consistently generated a 35% return on investment?
Yeah, on the average.
On the average.
These last 3 years it's been
higher than that.
But if you take the average over 26 years, it is actually 35%.
From what sprang this interest in Eastern Europe? You're from Hungary, born in Hungary,
Yes.
lived there during the Nazi occupation. Take me back to that experience for you, and
well, I mean,
how you survived.
Well, as a young man, I was 14 years old when the Germans came in, and I lived under false names. And if I hadn't done that, I would have been deported, and who knows whether I would have. The chances are that I would not have survived.
And what happened to your family?
We all survived because my father had enough sense to take evasive action.
And did that shape you in any way?
It was a formative experience.
And how did it shape you?
Well, that, and then afterwards the beginning of the communist regime, really taught me how important, what kind of society you live in. I mean, here in America, people take certain things for granted. Sort of democracy is like the air. It's just sort of is there. But if you look at the rest of the world, that is not the case. So it is at that time that I developed my own, say, convictions about what I call an open society. And when I had the means to do something about it, that's what I used my money for.
And a lot of people make a lot has been written about you in terms of, I guess, Professor Popper at the London School of Economics and other people who've had an influence on your thinking. And I assume you've been influenced by people like Havel and others who have had to fight the good fight for open societies and democracy at considerable risk to themselves. But what brought you, when you was there a moment in which you came to a realization, a kind of midlife crisis?
Yes.
What happened?
Well, that was in 1979 when I reached a certain level.
What's a certain level?
Let's say $100 million. Right. Actually, making money in the stock market is actually a very painful process. It's a tremendous tension, and you really make a very deep sacrifice to succeed.
What sacrifice do you make in
well,
terms
I mean,
of it takes its toll on stress and physical deterioration,
yes,
or what?
No, I mean, for me, there was always a large element of pain involved, because when you're wrong, you see, you have to feel that you're wrong, and you have to take. You have to correct your mistakes.
Does that make you a better investor, that you feel that pain?
Definitely. I think that without it, you would be carried out, because you would not feel that you've lost your touch, and you would be stuck in your wrong position, and that would be it.
Yeah. What is it you had, you think? I mean, you've spoken to that, in terms of the gift that you had. What was it that you understood? Perhaps one thing you have said, just to offer up one possible answer, was the notion that you understood how to learn from your mistakes quickly.
Well, that is correct.
What other things made you better and different?
Well, there's obviously there are certain aptitudes, and I mean, there's many different levels, but on a very abstract level, I've developed a philosophy which is the basis of my actions in the stock market and and my philanthropy, and that is the recognition that we are all fallible. That it's not only that the other fellow is wrong, but that you are wrong too. That in fact, trying to understand the the world in which we live and being a participant in that world, it's an impossibility to act on the basis of knowledge or of certainty, because you are one of the actors and your decisions are one of the things that change the situation. So it's a sort of a self-developing, self-evolving world that we live in which our fallibility, our mistakes are an important element in shaping history. So I look at the stock market and the financial markets as a historical process. And of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union was also a historical process. And so this let's say, recognition of one's fallibility is the guiding principle of both my activities.
I wonder if Mikhail Gorbachev has this philosophy and principle.
Most people don't.
Yeah.
I think that, in fact, most politicians can't afford to project fallibility. Even
because it looks like weakness and a failure of nerve or something.
Yes, and it's very difficult, actually, to accept this concept of an open society, which is based on this principle that nobody has a monopoly of truth, that we have to tolerate the fact that maybe the other fellow has got a point of view too. So that is actually the basis of open society. It's a very difficult principle to operate with because it means that you may be wrong. And that's a very difficult basis on which to convince others.
And especially when you're rolling the dice in which you've got huge amounts of consequences.
Yes.
If, in fact, you may be wrong.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, if you're not only risking your assets, but billions of dollars of other people's assets, and that if, in fact, you're wrong, the whole thing could... I mean, have you made a roll of the dice in which, in terms of, and it's not gambling, I mean, it is gambling, but it is not. I mean, you're based on informed opinion, and you're surrounded by people who participate in the decision-making, but have you made important, critical decisions in which, if it had gone wrong, everything was gone down the drain? In terms of way over leveraging yourself?
No.
You haven't risked it all.
No, I think this is one of the characteristics that I have, which is that I'm a survivor.
Yes.
Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here.
Yes.
And I'm a survivor because I try to avoid those risks. So I like to push to the limit of what is acceptable in terms of risk, but not over the limit.
Yeah. And it always comes down to what's an acceptable limit and how do you determine that, and that's where judgment and experience and wisdom comes in.
Yes, I mean, so far I've survived. So far I've survived.
So in 1979, you have $100 million, and you say, what?
What is it all about? What am I going to do with this money? And then I thought about it, and I decided that really what I care about is this concept of an open society. This is really the sort of the values of our civilization.
An open society as we think of in terms of America, in terms of free democratic institutions and free markets at work.
Yes. I mean, America is an open society. Of course, it's not a perfect open society because perfection is not attainable.
And we haven't done a great job at exporting it either.
And that's right. And everybody basically has to build their own form of democracy. But the idea of an open society is a universal idea, and certainly Western Europe. United States is a case in point, but you see, open society itself, the concept, has a weakness. It's a lack of conviction, a lack of commitment to the idea of an open society, and without it, it can't survive. You see, our prevailing idea is that everybody has to be out for himself, and that will bring about a sort of a best allocation of resources and a good society. It is not true. I think that we've all got to make sacrifices for it. We must be willing to stand up for it. And that is where there's a lack of will, a lack of political will in democracies, which has shown up at critical times. It showed up in Munich, and it is showing up in Bosnia. And that is actually the weakness of open society that needs to be overcome.
Yeah, it is. In a wholly different way, the sense of not taking for granted. I was thinking of in terms of those kids who took a stand at Tiananmen Square, in a sense, for the notion of democracy, albeit they were acting out of youthful enthusiasm in terms of democracy, but it was a commitment to an ideal and willing to make certain sacrifice. Same thing in terms of the people who surrounded Yeltsin and stood up against the tanks there, not knowing what might happen.
Yes.
So you decided then, which is fascinating to me, and the story has been told in another number of places, to begin to move around Eastern Europe, giving away money, and making alliances with pro-democratic, pro-open society
Yes.
individuals,
You see,
investing
people,
in human beings.
You see, people there have this sense of values. They know what freedom means. They know what, you don't need to explain to them the concept of an open society. So all I did was to find them and to support them. And basically all the work was done by them.
And with your money and
Yes,
and
my support.
About $1 billion, is that a fair?
Well, it's been committed, and I think I must have spent by now. That now we are running sort of in the range of a couple of $100 million.
Any question in your mind it's going to pay off?
It has paid off, and I think that the money that goes down the drain, because a lot of it does, I think it's worthwhile that it should go down the drain. In other words, in Bosnia, one has to take a stand. I mean, the people that I'm contributing to feeding, they get killed, so it's down the drain. Yes. But it still has to be done.
What has brought you the greatest satisfaction in your life?
I think that now the work of the foundation is something that I can really identify with. And it does give me satisfaction that I'm doing something not just for myself.
How do you feel about the enormous power that you have, without quibbling about it, because you know, and you're very careful, that your opinion about interest rates, about markets, about currencies can have a profound impact? Yes. How does that shape you?
I feel the way the porcupines feel about lovemaking.
Very careful. That's right. Israel. We talked, Benjamin Netanyahu was here. You would think that someone who survived what you did would have an incredible support for that country and for the notion of what it stands for. But I don't see in your record that.
It is true. It is true.
Why?
I mean, I have, of course, a sympathy because I'm Jewish. But to much of its history, Israel has been very much of a nationalistic country, and had I lived there, I would have been opposed to the policies. I think I would have been opposed to the policies of Likud. In the previous government. Well, I mean, he's a new chairman, but so maybe he's a new Likud. But I was certainly opposed, for instance, to the settlement of the West Bank. I did not want to say this in any way publicly, because I felt that if I wanted to say it, I ought to be an Israeli. I ought to go there and live there, and I didn't want to do that. So I have a lot of sympathy for Israel, and I'm thrilled by the very strong commitment to finding peace now in Israel.
When you look at the way the world is, what do you want, in the end, the first paragraph to be said about George Soros?
That he has explored the limits of possibilities, that made the most of his life.
A lot of people would certainly think that you have done that. I hope we can do this again and soon, because we've just begun to explore a whole lot of things, and your experience leads us to listen because of the commitment you have made in terms of utilizing funds, and also in terms of listening to what is going on in the ground and the amount of time you spend in Eastern Europe. And I'd love to hear your ideas about Asia, which is viewed as a huge economic growth area, at another conversation. I thank you very much for being here.
I enjoyed it.
It's a pleasure.